Good day to you. It's Tom Jordan. And Doge, not the cryptocurrency, but the Department of Government Efficiency. Doge, streamlining a bloated government, has taken center stage with the Department of Government Efficiency, led by Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk under President-elect Donald Trump. It's about time, right? The mission here is to slash bureaucracy, shutter these unnecessary agencies, and bring accountability to Washington, D.C., to the nation's capital. Maybe spread out the wealth a little bit around the country as well. Vivek Ramaswamy, he laid it out pretty plainly in this interview here with Maria Bartiromo on Fox Business. And he basically explained like that, listen, the entire federal agencies could face elimination, entire federal agencies, not all of them, but ones that are just completely inefficient and unnecessary. Deep cuts is what he is talking about to contractors and bureaucrats who have been overcharging taxpayers for decades, far too long, and even relocating some of these agency headquarters outside of Washington, D.C. All of that's on the table, and, you spread it out, decentralize power and make the government more accessible to the people the government serves. Makes sense to me. So Vivek says many federal workers don't even show up for their jobs in the first place. So simply, taking that first step of requiring these workers to work a full week might naturally trim the workforce. In other words, they might say, no, I'm not doing that. I quit. Okay, that's fine. But the ultimate goal here is dismantling an entire system where unelected, unaccountable civil servants wield outsized influence. This is what we call about the unelected bureaucrats. So we're going to hone in on one particular, outsized government-funded program today that is scheduled to cost you $1 billion next year, 2025. It's a state-funded news organization to attempt to spread its message around the world, all from a federal office in Washington, D.C. And some people call it just plain old state-run propaganda. $1 billion to run this thing. So Steve Cohen's going to be with me in just a few seconds. We're going to talk about that. What's the whole purpose of it anyway? And why should it cost that much money? Also, just want to remind you to chime in, comment, ask some questions, be a part of the dialogue here in the comments section of whatever you're watching on Facebook, on X, on YouTube, wherever you are. And I'll get to those in just a moment, of course, with my guest, Steve Cohen. Also, the best way you can truly help Tom Jordan Live is simply subscribe, click the notification bell and watch the videos or the podcast or listen to it and just share it as well. That's a big deal. All right. I am very intrigued about what's happening right now with this transition team underneath President-elect Donald Trump. And part of it is the DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency. And I think it's about time we did something like this, because among the waste and fraud and inefficiencies that Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy will be tasked at confronting in this monstrous government and hopefully getting rid of is something called the USAGM. It's a prime target for reform. It's the United States Agency for Global Media. Again, USAGM, this tax-funded giant with a $940 million budget for 2025 alone. That's almost as much as the budget for Tom Jordan Live. $940 million budget for 1 year for a news organization, almost $1 billion. So what do? What is the USAGM? Well, they are charged with promoting democracy and freedom through news outlets like Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, those types of things. And USAGM reaches about 450 million people across 100 different countries. And maybe the mission here is noble, but its effectiveness and objectivity, another big thing here, is deeply questionable. Remember, this is run by bureaucrats who tend to lean far left. The U.S. Agency for Global Media, deeply questionable. And a lot of critics here are arguing that it's straight up propaganda, state-run media that you and I are funding through our taxes. This massive operation, and it often mirrors the unbalanced biases that are seen in domestic legacy media. And you know the names of them: CNN, MSNBC, NPR, PBS, all those out there, the main legacy media news outlets. And it raises a whole slew of doubts about whether it is truly delivering honest and balanced news. Now, this whole thing was founded during the Cold War to counter Soviet and Chinese propaganda. So maybe back then it was maybe necessary. You got to get out the truth to fight the, disinformation wars back then during the Cold War. But today it's just a bloated relic, disconnected entirely from its original mission. Is it even necessary? Someone who believes Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy might find the solution is to redirect these taxpayer resources is a man named Steve Cohen, which we'll get to in a moment. He's a decades-long journalist, news director in major television newsrooms from New York, Detroit, Los Angeles, San Diego, and elsewhere, and the author of several books. So we'll get to Steve Cohen in just a bit. He's a dear friend of mine as well, and he is someone who still holds the core principles of solid journalism because he's been in the journalism industry, I think, since 1960s. Been a news director, I think, since 1973. And he covered the Nixon administration from way back when. So in any case, we're going to get to him in a moment. But again, $940 million, it's a big question. Is it set to consume nearly $1 billion taxpayer dollars in fiscal year 2025 for any good reason, broadcasting to more than 100 countries? Is there a real objectivity to this? And what are they putting out there? Who are they funding? Is there a legacy of bias in this? All of those things we're going to get to Steve Cohen right now. Steve, it's so good to have you here in the program. It's always nice to have you here and to talk with you, old friend. It's good to see you.
Good to see you, man. It's a little early for me, but I'm good.
Yeah, I know. You're on the West Coast, so I appreciate you getting up early and joining us. And I love what you wrote about this particular agency. Can you describe? I mean, you're
Sure.
a guy that's been in the news business, a stalwart of objectivity since, I would say late 1960s, but a news director since about 1973,
Yeah.
major news markets around the country. We have this state-funded, some even say a propaganda machine, but it's, ostensibly a news organization broadcasting to maybe 100 different countries. And most people are completely unaware that this thing even exists at almost the
Yeah. So
tune of a
let me
billion
run it
dollars.
down for you.
Yeah,
It's
go ahead.
called it's called the USA, United States Agency for Global Media. It's $940 million of our tax dollars. Okay. And what it does is it oversees 6 agencies around the world that are supposed to give information to people who can't get the so-called truth and bring it to them. So these news agencies are Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Voice of America, Mideast Broadcasting, Asian Broadcasting, and a technology center. And that's about 7,000 people, $900 million. Now, here's the problem. The person that runs it is appointed by the President of the United States.
Hmm.
So for the last 4 years, there's been a Democratic cohort there, a Pulitzer Prize winner, very wonderful woman, but not a broadcaster. And she's been in charge, but nobody knows at all what they're doing. So let's take an example. If you looked at America's coverage of the last election by mainstream media, you would find on a content analysis that over 80% of the stories about Donald Trump were negative. That's in America. So,
Hmm.
what are these 6 agencies doing in the way they are reporting the news to the countries that we're trying to reach? Well, nobody knows. I know that sounds amazing, but the last audit of the USAGM was done in 2021, and in that audit they said the firewall between the people that are running it, meaning the director, and the agencies isn't high or broad enough. We need a bigger firewall to protect the agencies from political influence. So that's the backdrop of this, Tom. And by the way, it doesn't report to the intelligence agencies. It's not supposed to be a propaganda arm. It reports to the State Department. So it's considered an arm of diplomacy, although the Secretary of State has no control over this agency. This is an agency that has an appointed person 5 advisors who have no voting power, and 6 agencies that are costing us $900 million. Now, do you think that the guys at DOGE, my friends, our
Yeah.
friends, Elon and Vivek, should take a look at this? I do. That's why I wrote the piece.
Yeah, and I hope they do, and I imagine they would because I can't imagine. I mean, let's talk about the budget in the first place because you've run a number of different newsrooms, and I look at that amount, $940 million, almost $1 billion, to effectively run a news agency. And granted, they have a lot of employees and
Sure.
whatnot, but just for a second, take out the probably lack of objectivity in this. Running a news agency, how does that compare? Almost $1 billion in 1 year to other, maybe even just legacy news outlets. I mean, is that even comparable, or is it just a complete waste of
No, it's
money?
not. No, it's not even close. Look, when I ran New York, and albeit it was in I ran WCBS Channel 2 in New York in the late 70s, and we had 250 people, budget of something like around $20 million. So say today it's 40 million to run a newsroom in New York. Uh, that's it. So if you took 40 million times 6, you only get to 240 million. So we're looking at 6 newsrooms, which have broadcast radio and all the internet, all the modern internet devices, right? Because you want to have that so people can be reached wherever they are. Uh, but that's six operations into 900 million. I mean, I just don't. I I pause here because I don't want to be just negative about this, but I don't understand where the money's going and how it's being distributed. But more importantly, if I'm the president of the United States and I appoint, let's say, me to run that agency, I want me to be able to have scrutiny over what those organizations are saying to make sure that the message of America is truthfully getting out to the people of the world. That's my problem with this. I don't see, Tom, how we can allow this group, which is inside our government. This is, just to be clear to your listeners, this is the largest publicly funded news operation in the world.
Hmm. Hmm.
And if you ask most Americans or tap on your congressman and say, what is this all about? I think you're going to get, hey, you're kidding me, right?
Yeah, well, it's shocking because you often hear, Chinese state-run media or Russian state-run media. Well, the United States has a state-run media that is larger than both of those major state-run media outlets. And you could talk about North Korea as well. So
Well, that's right.
it is shocking to understand that this actually is happening in this country, this, bastion of democracy where we're having, yeah, sure, we got the First Amendment and the freedom of the press. But when you have, and I'll kind of put this anecdote out there because when I've traveled overseas and you get some people confronting you when they find out that you're American, they immediately go to the politics of the United States. And it's almost always negative if there's a Republican in office. Now, this has happened to me a few different times over the past few years when I've been overseas. And I think to myself, where are they getting their information? Who's covering the United States from whether I'm in Budapest or I'm in, London, England, wherever it is? And I wasn't aware of this agency back then. But now that I am, I'm
Yeah.
thinking, okay, is this the information they're getting, and what are they saying about people like Donald Trump or back then George W.
Well,
Bush? It seems skewed.
let me take you back historically how this all happened. Okay, so it's 1953. General Eisenhower is president, Ike, and he's got 2 guys that are working with him. One is John Foster Dulles, who's running the State Department, and then John Foster Dulles' brother, Alan, who's running all the intelligence agencies, right? And so they sit together in the White House, and they say to Ike, we're going to lose the battle of communication as the commies are taking over the world. We need to have a vehicle where we can say what America is, the beauty of American culture, music, art, and we've got to get that out. So they formed something called the United States Information Agency in 1953, and that's where this comes from. So in 1953, it's an anti-communist, like you said earlier, propaganda instrument. But the propaganda they send is this. They realize, these 3 warriors, that what America is really selling, our most important product, is freedom. And freedom is exhibited mostly in culture and arts. So they take Elvis, Ella Fitzgerald, Duke Ellington, Van Cliburn, the great pianist, and they set them up around the world, going to places where freedom does not exist and allowing them to play and to communicate. And so they overwhelm the communist ideology with America's free culture. And that works. I mean, we won the Cold War. It took us a long time, but it was part of their policy of containment. They say, how do we contain communism? Well, we're going to create Voice of America. We're going to create Radio Free Europe, and we're going to make damn sure that what we say to those people is the truth that's happening outside of the communist Iron Curtain. That's how it started. And then years later, it continues. Edward R. Murrow, by the way, ran the United States Information Agency for JFK at the end of his career. And so from there, we get to this. And it's an agency with a purpose, but is the purpose being met? That's all I'm asking. And cannot the new Trump administration review this agency in detail? Now, Stephen Bannon, as you know,
yes.
Steve Bannon, War Room Bannon. When Trump had his first administration, they had a cohort, a friend of Mr. Bannon, whose name was Michael Pack, who was a documentarian and did right-wing documentaries, and they put him in as a director. He got in for 6 months, fired a few people, and that wall was just so high and broad that he didn't give up. He just said, this is nuts. We're not even close to getting anything done. And he left just as Biden came in. So there was a shot at it, but they blew it. So here we go again. We've got another 4 years. Do we want this agency to continue with it? Their authorization in 2025 is $940 million.
Wow, yeah, that's amazing. So, and you talk about how you spread freedom and the message of freedom around the world. And I do remember, Billy Joel going to the Soviet Union and playing, I think, in Moscow and in St. Petersburg at the time.
Yeah,
there was that. There was UB40 back in the 1980s, spreading that kind of culture around. And that does speak volumes. But this is a different time and a different place now, and a different ideology that has infiltrated our country compared to back then. And I can't stop thinking about, okay, the Department of Justice, the FBI, going into these social media platforms and dictating to them, Twitter at the time and Facebook and wherever else you look, what they're allowed to have on their platforms and what they're not allowed to have on their platforms. And I think, okay, does this correlate somehow to what's happening with this particular agency? Are there political ideologues going into these various, 6 funded news organizations around the world being dictated about, because it's no longer Billy Joel in UB40. It's now, I would imagine, politics and ideology. When you think of capitalism versus Marxism and socialism, those are now seemingly the messages that are being touched on by these various agencies.
Well,
do you believe that the Department of Justice and these other government-funded agencies are getting involved or sticking their nose in these so-called news outlets?
The answer is I don't think it's that difficult. I don't think they have to. And here's why. Because I think that the mentality of the people in these agencies is not dissimilar from the mentality of mainstream media in the United States, which is that there is an inherent bias that's come over many decades that is pro-progressive, that is, you can go through the list of things that it is. It's pro-abortion, it's pro-gender, it is LGBTQA rights, it is anti-Israel, it is pro-Palestinian. I mean, all of these things, you can just lay out a list of what progressive media people believe in their hearts. And again, I'm not critiquing what they believe. All I'm saying is, where's the balance? And I think that it seems natural to me that the people that populate these 6 agencies would have the same sort of theoretical bias that I've just stated. And that becomes a natural formula for the way they view what's happening in America, that they're going to portray to the world. And I think that when you look at that as the construct, you don't need an outside intelligence agency to tell you what to do. Instead, they're naturally going to do that. So if you take something as simple as climate change, and say, what is President Trump's view of climate change and energy and his recent appointment of who's going to run the Department of Energy? How is that portrayed in these 6 different networks? Is it portrayed in a positive light, or is it portrayed in a negative light? Here's a really good example from yesterday. Yesterday, Donald Trump and Elon Musk, 2 billionaires, 2 men of accomplishment, are standing together in Texas, and they're watching the largest and heaviest object, which is the heavy starlight,
Yeah.
leave Earth. This has never happened before. Okay, never happened. Okay, this is 16 million pounds of thrust. Half of that took Saturn V to the moon. 16 million pounds of thrust. Everything could have gone wrong at that moment. Everything. The only thing that could go right is what happened. It went up into the sky. American media gave it this much coverage. And this much coverage to Oz, okay? And this much coverage to Miss McMahon.
Yes.
And this much coverage to Lutnick. And this much coverage to one of the biggest, most breakthrough scientific advancement in the history of man. That thing's going to go to Mars someday. And Trump and Musk stood there knowing that everything could have gone wrong. And American media gave it this much coverage. Well, how much coverage did these 6 networks give it?
Oh, yeah.
Well, my guess is they gave it the same amount of coverage as mainstream
Sure.
media gave it.
And you know that if things
So-
did go wrong, it would have gotten that much coverage, a lot more than, McMahon or
Yeah,
the-
Musk screws up. Elon Musk screws up. Another screw
Right.
up. But so you have to say to yourself, if our news judgments are so out of joint, and I think that's a good example. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't cover the other things. I'm not saying that at all. But I'm saying that when you look at proportionality, which ultimately is the measure of how news judgments are made and what we know or don't know in America, and you get this much of a scientific breakthrough, and this much of politics and how you don't like what Trump is doing, what does that tell you about bias? And what does it tell you about balance? And all I'm saying is that this USAGM needs to be reviewed, analyzed, and a content analysis made during the early part of this Trump administration before the $940 million is allocated to continue it the way it has been for the last 4 years.
Yeah, it's taxpayer money. And, you talk about, I think it is propaganda because even you brought up, that Donald Trump named Linda McMahon as his pick for education secretary. And the coverage is simply this, primarily that Donald Trump is going to get rid of education. When in fact, what they're trying to do is return education to its former glory and giving it back to the states so the states have control over how they educate their kids. But that's not the message. It is propaganda. And I'm not at all convinced that same message in this one story is not being propagated around the world based on this taxpayer funding. But the Biden administration, they do appear, and you wrote about this, that they're more focused on protecting USAGM and their autonomy rather than examining the outcomes and the operations of it. Like, are they effective and is it efficient? Do you think taxpayers should demand that they understand?
I think for me, the ultimate test is it truthful? That's a word that in the discussion about American media generally is just not there anymore. Is it truthful? Because I think that the world you and I were brought up in as journalists is that we had a responsibility to put our biases. We had biases, okay? I have my bias, but I'm going to put them aside if I'm running a newsroom. And I'm going to do everything I can to try to be an honest broker of information. What does honest broker mean? It means that there's proportionality on both sides of the aisle on issues that are in conflict. Hegel, the great German philosopher, had this idea called a dialectic. All dialectic is there's a thesis out here and there's an antithesis. And these two things collide. And their collision leads to truth. And that's why you're an honest broker. You're allowing the thesis and the antithesis to come together in conflict and collide. Why? Hegel said, because the collision of opposite forces leads to truth. And every time you put truth on the table in front of people, it leads to an evolution of what's happening in society. Without truth, you can't evolve. If you hide the truth, you go backwards. Where are we in American media, and where are we in terms of talking to the world? Are we trying to have a dialectic that is honest, and that dialectic leads to answers, and those answers lead to truth? Every time you click off a truth, we go forward. Every time you avoid truth, we go backwards, or we stay where we are. How much of American media has been dealing with keeping us where we are, even after Trump's election? Tom, look what's happened in American media.
Mm-hmm.
How much of mainstream media is talking about anything that Trump is doing that might take us to the next step versus taking us backwards? We just can't get rid of Miss Harris and the failure of the GOP this election cycle. Mainstream media wants to continue to discuss those issues as though they had value. If they had value, they would have won the election.
Right. I think you bring up that because one of the questions I often hear, and I was going to bring up to you, but you just accurately explained how we come to some realm of understanding what is true about all these different issues. It's argumentation, this dialectic that you outlined there is critical in journalism. Of course, that has to happen. There needs to be debate, conflict in order to find out, sift all this, this get to the core issue here. But that is now being called disinformation, or it's being called uncivil. And that to me is the danger, that we need to be civil at the cost of getting to the truth. We want to have joy, and that means no more argumentation. And to me, that is such a ruse. It's this guise in order to put in some type of, for those who want to stay in power, they don't want you to argue their points because they know they're lying to you. And I think going back to those old arguments of Kamala Harris, she never sat down really for a legitimate interview. She wouldn't answer questions. And it finally got some, at least in the mainstream media, to say, listen, she's not saying anything here. And, it's shame on them for not really addressing that issue. I think CNN brought it up after the election, complaining about Kamala Harris never answering the question. She did the American people a disservice, but they've refused to bring that up prior to the election. So this is just, it's hopefully there's a mandate now for the news media to wake up as well. We got a question here, Steve, and I want to bring it up while we got you here for one of our viewers here. Let's bring that on the screen. It's from Harry Sakalian. It says, "Good morning, Tom. Please ask Mr. Cohen a few specifics on how a federal agency would be dismantled. Aren't most federal employees fireproof? Thanks, Harry Sakalian." Good question, Harry. Steve, what do you think?
I think Harry brings up a really important point about what the guys at Doge, I call my article Elon and Vivek, their excellent adventure, after the old movie of the excellent adventure, because it's not as simple as they say. Harry's right, and he should be right. Any employee who works for the federal government, who's hardworking, doing what they're asked, puts in the hours, just to summarily dismiss them without a review would be wrong, be totally wrong. Everyone needs to have their day in court and an understanding of why they're losing their job or not. However, you do have authority to look at an agency and, after an analysis of what they're doing, to decide whether or not it will be funded. It is the funding mechanism that puts into effect anything that we're going to do that's going to limit and make a government smaller and more efficient. Then you're able to set up a pattern where federal employees would be told in a smart way under human resources conditions, yeah, you're going to be laid off. This job's not going to exist anymore. There you go. So
Yeah.
it's a matter of appropriation, where the money goes, and once the appropriation is lifted or restricted, then the agency is duty bound to reevaluate their costs and to take action that they have to. So that doesn't happen overnight, Harry. It takes time, but they're not bulletproof in the sense that if the appropriation goes away, the people that work there can go away. So if you've got an agency like the one we're talking about today, that's got somewhere in the neighborhood of 7,000 or so employees, they don't just suddenly disappear, but there is a process where if Congress decided not to appropriate or to appropriate less, that over time the agency would become smaller and more efficient, or go away completely. That's why Ms. McMahon is going to be the head of education, because everyone knows it takes leadership to figure out what I'm talking about. The analysis of an agency takes strong leadership of folks who understand how to run things and move them. And I think that's when people talk about the celerity of the changes that Trump is after. He has to move quickly in order to say, this is the bar that I'm setting. But once the bar is set, there is an administration of 4 years there to try to fix any of that, to try to fix or remediate any of these
Yeah. And
agencies. I mean, I know that Vivek thinks that, oh well, here's what I say, I'll wave my hand and everything will happen.
no.
It doesn't work that way. I mean, and I think Elon Musk is the same. They both have this sense of great power that comes from their intellect, and their intellect tells them that they are not only resourceful, but that anything can be accomplished, and that's what makes them who they are. But when you're looking at the reality of American government, the first step is their step: identify the problem, seek remedy, take action. It's
Yeah.
identify the problem, seek a remedy, take action. That's the process. And in that process, we've learned through the years that very little gets done. That's the definition of the swamp. The
Yeah.
swamp is identification, no remedy, no action. So you have to start with identification, seek remedy, but then you've got to take action. And I think that, Americans are saying, well, we think this guy, Trump, might do it. And by the way, Trump was the spark. He's not the fire. We're the fire.
Yeah.
The American people are the fire. To sustain the warmth of the country we want, we have to be the ones that are hardy, not just the guy who sets the spark. That there's a difference there.
Yeah, and that's going to mean, Steve, that we as the people who govern ourselves essentially have to call our members of Congress, because even Elon Musk might come in and listen. He slashed, I think, 80% of the jobs at Twitter when he took it over. You can't do that in government. There's congressional appropriations and whatnot, and I know that this group, USAGM, they report to, I think, 6 different congressional committees.
They
So
do.
they're getting the funding. So that means working and cooperating with Congress as well. We're speaking with Steve Cohen. He's a decades-long broadcast journalist and news director, major news markets around the country. We have another comment here, Steve. I want to bring that in. Cameron's watching that. R. Paulus, curious, when did you media professionals realize this is happening? What era? What is
Well,
that? What's the answer to that, Steve?
I take the sarcasm to heart. I think that we've always known it. I think there's always been an ongoing debate, but I think, frankly, that um, the stakes are so high now. I think that's why so much is happening. That over and I'm going to go back to the 90s. I think when you look at the end of the Reagan era and you look at Bill Clinton's first administration, you begin to see a realization of how much needed to be changed. And people don't, I think, give President Clinton enough credit. In his first administration, they did the job in terms of taking a look at the budget, trying to get us to a more balanced budget, getting our deficit down. It all began to fall apart as politics took hold and his efforts to um, change the healthcare system came in. But if you go from the early 90s and then move to now, you see that we really were not able to solve any of the problems. The deficit grew, budget grew, government grew, and most importantly, the American people did not seem to be getting what we needed, which was just the basics of the American dream. And
Yeah.
I think that to answer the question by the viewer, the the cessation of the American dream goes to the soul of all of us. The soul of America is that, one, we have freedoms and they will be protected. we are all equal, and that will not ever be defiled. And at the same time, there's this sense of trust that those who we elect will hold those things dearly in their own souls and make sure that all of us are protected. And I think what's happened over the last 4 decades is that that's unraveled. And we still believe it, and we still hold it. But it shouldn't be just a dream. It needs to
Mm.
be a reality. And so when
Mm.
you let immigrants come in large numbers, illegal immigrants come in large numbers, when you let prices rise, when you spend your time focused on climate change, when all of us want to drive cars with gasoline, and we sit on the natural resources that are so rich and God-given in the United States of America and are talking about not using them rather than figuring out how to utilize them, you lose heart. And I think that's what's happening. The shift that happened in this last election isn't really about Trump or Harris. It's about what I just described. It's about this sense that the American dream is gone. And guess what? When you lose your dreams, you lose your hope.
Mm.
And the
And the
elixir
fight is
and
not
the
over.
elixir, that's right. And the elixir of hope is freedom, man.
Yeah,
It's
you know,
freedom.
but there's still a very large enemy out there, and you brought up one of the things that is threatening the freedom in this country. And there was this COP conference in Azerbaijan, I think, is where it's held this year, and the
Yeah.
whole purpose was to basically take trillions and trillions, and maybe 20-30 trillion dollars from Western countries, under the guise of fighting climate change and protecting the climate, but it's really just to take the money that we've earned in this country and give it to third world countries. And it's really an effort to take away the freedoms of the United States, the money that we've earned through, capitalism, through the freedom to start your own business, to find your
Yeah.
own way towards prosperity, which is so unlike most other countries in this world. They now want to take those freedoms or the benefits from those freedoms and then give them to somebody else. All the benefits without the work that it took to get all those benefits from it. And it's happening right now. So as you said, Donald Trump's a spark, but it really is up to us and to be aware of what's happening, I think, on a global scale, to strip away yours and mine and every American's freedom that has been hard fought and hard, won over many, 200 years now, plus 250 years. I want to end on this because I think this is important, because I don't know how, I haven't heard Vivek and, Elon, Bill and Ted, as you have referred to them, they're excellent inventors. I haven't heard them discuss this particular agency as of yet. But being that it is so large and in taking up so much money, do you think this is something they're going to tackle? And if they do, would it be an attempt to get rid of the agency or maybe just reform it? Which tactic would be better, do you think?
One, I think it has to get into the agenda, and at least as far as I can tell, it's not into the agenda. They've got so many other things to deal with. But this is important as anything else. I mean, this is not a small matter. What we're saying to the world and what we're paying for to say to the world is critical. And I think that step one is to identify it needs to be on their agenda. Step two is to do content analysis of what each of these agencies is doing. After that analysis is done, to go to Congress and say, this is what we found out. I'm not talking about a financial review as much as I am a content review, which is
Hmm.
less costly. And then once you have that in hand, then you take action. And I think the action may be the unraveling of this agency. I mean, I think that there's so many ways for information to flow these days. To think that we have to spend 900 million American dollars to get the word to some guy in Azerbaijan,
Right. It,
it just doesn't. It just doesn't make sense to me. But I think, Tom, that I want to end with some optimism. I
yes.
believe that I believe that this is a sea change. That we're entering a new age of governance. That we're entering a new age of understanding. That we all are in this together. And as President Trump has said, common sense. It's time, Tom, for Thomas Paine to return.
Hmm.
We need common sense back in America. We have it inherently. We just need to be able to exhibit it. And I'm optimistic that we can, and that there's no problem, including this agency, that can't be solved by our action.
No, amen. I agree with that. I always feel optimistic every time I talk with you, Steve, because you're a wealth of information and knowledge and identifying issues, but then taking those issues that have been identified and trying to find some solution to fix those things for a better world for all of us. I always appreciate you joining me and taking the time. I know it's early out there in the West Coast
Happy
of
to do it.
California, so I appreciate you getting up early and being on the program live here on Tundra and Live.
I'm not
Steve
usually
Cohen.
I'm not usually this lucid, Tom. So thank you.
I appreciate it very much. Steve Cohen, as always, we'll talk soon. I'll give you a call later today. All
Thanks,
right.
Tom.
All right. Thanks so much. What a good guy. And he really is. If you look back, and he's written a bunch of books, you should look at his books. Go on Amazon and look at Steve Cohen. And he writes about things. He's written about, he wrote about the media, the current state of media. It's a eulogy, the way he titles that book. But he also has written about manhood, what it means to be a strong individual. He's a fighter for civil liberties. And he does it from objectivity, and he's not afraid to deal with the issues on both sides or all sides of a particular, controversy. Let's get to it so we can get to some realm of truth. So I've always appreciated him. I worked for Steve many years back when I was in San Diego, working in his newsroom for quite some time. So I always appreciate Steve Cohen. All right, want to get some headlines here. Then we got another thing. We're going to talk about communication in just a bit as well. We mentioned Linda McMahon. Donald Trump has named her as the education secretary as his pick and promising bold reforms within that very inefficient and ineffective department. It's a move that's, sparking conversation, to say the least. But President-elect Donald Trump has announced Linda McMahon. It's his pick for Secretary of Education, and McMahon, best known as the co-founder of WWE alongside her husband, Vince McMahon, but a brilliant businesswoman and a former leader, by the way, of the Small Business Administration under Donald Trump in his first term. And so she brings a mix of business acumen and public service experience to this role. So the announcement, which was made yesterday, it was last night on Truth Social, Donald Trump's social media platform. Donald Trump emphasized McMahon's commitment to giving parents and states more control over education. And here's what Trump said. He said, quote, Linda will fight tirelessly to expand choice for every state and empower parents to make the best education decisions for their families. Couldn't agree with that more. Some media news outlets are saying, oh, he wants to dismantle education. No, he wants to improve education by giving it back to the states and local control. That's where the kids are being educated in your neighborhoods. So let's bring it back effectively to the neighborhoods and the districts and the states in which they're being educated, in which these kids live. And the parents should have much more say in how their kids are being educated. And McMahon, by the way, she's no stranger to education policy. She served on Connecticut's Board of Education. She worked to oversee public schools there in the state's technical high school system. And I think Donald Trump's statement outlines a pretty clear vision. Decentralize education by returning decision-making power to the states and cutting through Washington bureaucracy. And that's a sentiment that's echoed by former Education Secretary Betsy DeVos, by the way, who Governor Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan can't stand because Betsy DeVos was fighting for parental authority over how their kids are being educated, not unions dictating how the kids, who they don't know, should be taught about a whole slew of issues that have nothing to do with education. So good for Trump on this. McMahon at the helm here, I think the education plan looks poised to prioritize education, to prioritize school choice, local control, and breaking down what conservatives often see as the federal overreach in education policy. There's going to be a lot of fierce debate regarding this, of course, as it goes on before Congress. Speaking of Congress, slim GOP House majority, this hinges on some uncalled races. There are still 5 of them. The balance in power in D.C. there, you see some of the freshman members of Congress there going in for their orientation a few days ago. But the power, in terms of the stretch of power for the GOP, it does remain in limbo as there are 5 House races yet to be called, spread across Alaska, California, Iowa, and Ohio. And Republicans have secured, of course, right now the majority. I think it's 218 seats, but the final margin is razor thin, and the stakes are pretty for partisan leadership and legislative strategy. Really are pretty stark right now. So it's very important that the Republicans, if they want to have more say, get a larger majority than that. So you got Alaska's at-large district. Republican Nick Begich leads Democratic incumbent Mary Peltola by just over a couple of points there. Nearly all of the votes there have finally been counted. It's taken a while, but Begich's lead of roughly 7,500 votes has Republicans eyeing a potential flip in the traditional red state. Watching that as well as in California, the 13th district in California, it's a nail biter as well. Republican John Duarte holding a razor-thin 50.1% lead over the Democrat there, Adam Gray. And you just got 227 votes that are separating those candidates in California. Democrat Derek Tran has taken a narrow 314-vote lead over Republican incumbent Michelle Steele out there, and that's a stark shift in a district Steele was expected to hold. So watching that as well. Then you go to Iowa right now, the first district there, Republican incumbent Marionette Miller Meeks has declared victory with an 800-vote lead over the Democrat there, Christina Bohannon, though a recount is looming in that Iowa first district as well. And similarly, in Ohio's 9th district, Democrat Marcy Kaptur clings to an 833-vote edge against Republican in Ohio, Derek Marin, with a recount likely is there as well. So a lot of tight races, and the delegate balance of power in Congress, every seat there could shape the legislative agenda under House Speaker Mike Johnson. And so he's like, listen, the stakes couldn't be higher. He held a press conference yesterday. The GOP is preparing to navigate a slim and potentially fractious majority in the House. All right, something we're told wasn't happening. These violent Venezuelan gangs. This one, Tren de Aragua, expands to 16 states amid the border crisis. This Venezuela in Tennessee, that's what you're seeing right there. This is Tennessee. But they're in 16 different states. They are a violent gang. We've heard about them, but mainstream media is saying, no, they're not a problem. They're not taking anything over. Yeah, they're setting up shop throughout this country. Tren de Aragua, or you can just refer to them as TDA. 16 different U.S. states they've infiltrated already, and they're capitalizing on this border crisis that critics argue has been obviously they've won the argument. It's been worsened by the Biden-Harris administration. According to Homeland Security, this memo that they put out, which was obtained, by the way, by the New York Post, the gang's brutal operations have surged in spreading violence, drug trafficking, human exploitation all across the United States. Yeah, these guys are here, and they're wreaking havoc. And listen, these people, they originated in an area in Venezuela. It's this Tucuran prison that they were let out of. So they were let out of prison in Venezuela, and they were brought to the United States, and with them brought a reign of terror to major cities like New York, Nashville, Tennessee, and Denver, Colorado. And they're already being accused of murders here, police shootings, sex trafficking of migrant women, often using fraudulent schemes to finance further criminal enterprises back in South America, so sending the money back there. So Homeland Security, these reports are now revealing that the gang's takeover of apartment buildings and the involvement in violent battles with drug cartels, it continues, and it does exist. So now in Tennessee, the Bureau of Investigation there, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, is warning that TDA's grip in Tennessee is growing rapidly in cities like Memphis, not just Nashville now, it's Memphis and Chattanooga. Human trafficking operations there have exploded in those cities in Tennessee, in the middle of the country. Law enforcement, however, is often, hamstrung because of insufficient immigration detainers. There's not a lot they can do there while they start taking over apartment complexes and demanding rent from the apartment dwellers there. Now, the critics, including former Customs and Border Protection Commissioner Mark Morgan, blame lax border policies for enabling this expansion. And they say that the gang's criminal operations are a slow growing cancer in this country. And he said that warning the impact on this country and on American communities will last for decades and decades. So when you hear a news anchor on a certain particular local news outlet say they're not taking over anything, this is just propaganda, don't believe them, because what they're saying is they haven't taken over the government, but what they are not acknowledging is that they've taken over apartment complexes and they're starting to take over more and more communities. They do exist and they are here. And it's interesting how we're being told that, those things weren't happening, yet we see it right in front of our face. The narrative that was being communicated was inaccurate, and it continues to fuel distrust. And one of the things that is facilitating a country in disarray is the same thing that facilitates a bad marriage or a dysfunctional business climate or bad morale, poor communication, from which divisions develop and failure soon follows. I spoke with a business executive about this, a communication expert, who says good communication starts from the very top. My guest is Vanessa Denhag Garmo, the author of Conversations That Create the Culture. And in a time when division and miscommunication dominate both, workplaces and society at large, Vanessa Denhag Garmo offers a much needed blueprint, if you will, for clarity and connection. And Vanessa joins me now. Vanessa, so nice to have you. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me, Tom. Great conversation to be having right now in the culture we live in.
It's so important. And what was the genesis? I mean, your motivation for writing this book in the first place?
Well, this actually came to me many years ago when I was earning my master's degree in communications. I had to learn how to do communication audits for my degree. And I started doing a few of them at client offices when I was coaching and consulting people. And then I realized this is such a great value when I was coaching leaders, that there's such a disconnect in the workplace and the way people communicate. And oftentimes leaders and executives wouldn't realize the breakdown was communication.
Well, one of the things you talk about in the book, and I want to kind of frame this in the context of what I'm witnessing, and I think most people are witnessing right now, is this lack of consistency in communication. So, for example, prior to, let's say, Donald Trump's winning the election a couple of weeks ago, and prior to that, there are a lot of media outlets and hosts calling him some pretty bad things, bad
Yeah.
names, these threats, and identifying him with these authoritarian leaders who led these massive genocidal regimes
Yeah.
that are very well known. But now that the election's over, they've toned it back, and now they're meeting with him. And to me, what that does is shows that there is a total lack of consistency in their messaging, which leads me to believe their initial messaging was incorrect and it was insincere, it was disingenuous. Can you touch on the critical role of consistency in messaging for, we can talk about, societal success, but in your space, in organizational success, how can inconsistent communication damage maybe employee trust, or not just employee trust, but, client trust as well?
Absolutely. That you just hit the nail on the head. It's about trust, Tom. And when you don't have consistency and consistent messages in the workplace, there's confusion. And then the employees or the team members don't know who to trust. Do I trust this manager or that manager? In fact, that just came up in a coaching call the other day with a client who said, I have two different managers and they're telling me two different things, and I don't know who to listen to and who to believe and what's the right message. And so oftentimes departments don't even talk to each other. So one manager in one department's not talking to the manager in the other department. And then the employees are all confused because nobody knows who's supposed to do what. So consistency is key, not just what you say, when you say it, how you say it, what platforms you're using. People need to know, I'm going to get this message at this time from my company. The newsletter comes out on this day. It helps with trust, unity, and productivity when they know a certain message is coming to them at a certain time and every leader's on the same page.
Well, that's the thing. It starts with leadership. They've got to be on the same page. So they got to make sure that their messaging strategies are in line with one another. And it's the age old, dilemma of mom and dad not communicating. And then they each tell their kids something different. And then the kids use that against them as leverage and say, well, mom told me this or dad told me that. So I'm going with what they say. And that's
Yeah.
a problem, not just in the family, but in corporate culture as well. You touch on like various communication channels. I mean, there's the messaging strategy, but then there's I guess, the vehicle in order to do that correctly. What do you mean by that? How can organizations ensure that, they're leveraging, I guess, the right tools, the right channels for their teams?
That's a great question. That's something that comes up in an audit all the time. I always ask employees, how are you communicating, or what is your preferred form of communication? Some will say email, some will say face to face, some will say, well, it depends on the message. And then they realize there's such a disconnect because half the employees love email, the other half wants face to face or on the phone. And then they're missing information from each other because they're communicating differently. There's got to be a consistent way that, when it comes to this kind of conversation, we can send it out in an email. But if it's critical information where content could be lost, we need to meet face to face. So there's got to be a consistent way to share information within the workplace so nothing is lost. So there's no gaps. And that's one of the things that comes up in an audit all the time. And you touched upon the media, Tom. I want to just touch upon that. They labeled Trump a certain way prior to the election, and now they're trying to do interviews with him after. I think that also speaks to the lack of having your pulse on your target audience, whether it be the media, whether it be a leader. If you don't have your pulse on the people that are listening to your message, you're going to lose them. And I think you saw that with the media. I think a lot of them were shocked that Trump won because they didn't have their pulse on the American people and where they were coming from. And I think that happens in corporate America all the time.
Oh yeah, if you're not engaged in the people that you're serving, with the media analogy to this. They were living in a bubble, and it wasn't just this election. I think they were out of sync with their viewership and who they were trying to serve for many, many, many years because they were
Yeah.
so aligned to something that their audience was not aligned with, and their audience finally figured out we're not seeing things eye to eye on this. So that's incredibly important to stay engaged with that. There's another thing that I used to do a lot of media training. I still sometimes do, but when I would go into an organization, I would find out that the leaders within the organization couldn't give me or couldn't explain very clearly who they really were or what were their goals as an organization. They just wanted to be on the news, or they just wanted to get their message out, but they didn't know what their message was. And it oftentimes became fragmented, like it didn't align with what their true organization's goals are. So when you're
Yeah.
doing like a communications audit, how do you bridge that gap? How do you bridge the gap between the organization's goals and ultimate objectives versus what they're putting out there, whether it's to their team or to their ultimate customer base?
That's such a great point, Tom. I'm doing an audit right now with an organization, and I ask every single employee that I'm interviewing, what is the company's vision? And there is such a disconnect because there's no consistency in what the vision is. Nobody really knows the vision. So if your employees don't know your vision, how is the public going to understand your vision? How are you going to communicate that to the general public? I also ask the clients, what is it that your company provides to your customer? They each have different messages. They don't even know. Everybody's not even on the same page of what their company provides to their client. So how are you going to convey that in a consistent manner if everybody in the organization doesn't even know what you do? So yeah, that's a huge disconnect, and that's very common. Or people will write vision statements and mission statements, they'll put it on their website and never look at it again.
Yeah,
You have to revisit these things.
right.
Is your vision and your mission statement in line with what you're providing to the public? And if it's changed, then that vision and mission statement needs to change. So that disconnect is actually very common time in the workplace.
Yeah, and I would say like if you never check your mission statement ever again, it kind of shows that it was disingenuous in the first place. Like you didn't really
Yeah,
believe in it, therefore you're
yeah,
never going to go back to it because it was just something to do to start a business. I
yeah,
remember there's been a number of occasions where when I was in the news media and television news, and we would start building a new, maybe it's a new studio or a new department or something we're going to start honing in on from an editorial perspective. And the people making those decisions would never engage the ones that were going to implement the
yeah,
realities of whatever that endeavor was going
yeah,
to be. And
yes.
so by the time all the decisions were made, it didn't work because the people who were experts in carrying that mission out, they weren't engaged in the process of making it successful. So how, to that point, how important is it that the leadership in an organization, that they're engaging the employees and the feedback from the employees in crafting their communication strategies?
Because they have to go on listening tours. I tell managers this all the time. You have to spend most of your time listening to your teammate members and not just issuing out protocols and statements or telling them how you think it should be. They're doing the work every single day. And often what happens sometimes is companies will put managers in positions to manage a department they've never worked in. And so now there's a huge disconnect. They don't even know how to do the job of the people they're managing. So I always tell leaders and managers, go on listening tours, ask questions. Don't just assume you know what these people are doing every single day or how to do their job. Ask them, even shadow them. I had a manager who went around shadowing all the departments that reported to him. And he said that was the best learning experience of my life because I really understood what they do on a day to day basis. I thought I knew, but he really did not know.
Yeah, I heard a story of a pastor who was from the city and decided to become a pastor in a very, rural farming community. And he went out there, and it's a tiny church, and he wanted to engage and connect with them. So he started talking about farming equipment, but he mispronounced all the equipment names and didn't understand the process. And they all discounted him right away because
Yeah.
clearly he didn't know what he was talking about. So to your point, make sure you understand the department. If you're not the right manager for that particular area, then try something else. You've misplaced an individual.
Yes.
How do you think about, there's always this talk about, our return on investment. Like, okay, we're gonna implement this, but what is our ROI? And maybe touch on how important, messaging and communication is and how it relates and impacts profitability.
Oh, tremendously, Tom. I mean, I have seen such a disconnect in corporations where, like I said, one manager doesn't know what the other manager is doing, but yet the departments rely on each other, and it affects the bottom line because sometimes you're inefficient in time management. You've built the wrong equipment, or you've labeled the wrong product, or maybe you're putting together marketing materials and you put together the wrong marketing materials because this person wasn't talking to that person. It affects the bottom line tremendously. It affects how they build relationships and how they service their clients. And it still shocks me on the communication disconnect on simple things like how many pieces of this did this client order? They didn't communicate it correctly, so they misordered it, and it cost the company money. It happens all the time.
It does. Yeah, communication is one of those often overlooked elements of running a business, but it
Yeah.
impacts, I mean, the ultimate reason you're in business is to make money, and it impacts your profitability. And it's one thing, I think, to like identify the gaps and maybe the opportunities that have been, misaligned with, communication. It's another thing once you've identified it to figure out what to do next. So how do you do that? How do you, like, you pinpoint maybe some disconnect or a gap, and then how do you, I guess, consult and ask, instruct the leaders how to implement targeted strategies to plug the holes, if you will.
So we put together a strategic plan after we create the audit. After we assess the audit, we conduct the audit, we assess it, and then we put together a strategic plan. For instance, in one company I was auditing, there was a lot of what I call water cooler kibitzing. You know what I mean? The water cooler conversations, and they weren't fruitful. Sometimes those are fruitful. You'll have impromptu meetings because you bumped into somebody in the hallway and you guys actually talked and solved the problem. Most
Hmm.
of the time, it's gossip. And so I'll show to a leader, you're having a lot of gossip going on because you're not communicating to these people what's going on. And so they're making assumptions. Oh my gosh, that person got laid off. That means we're all going to get fired because they didn't properly communicate that. And it becomes a disconnect. And now they're not productive in the workplace because they're too busy gossiping. So after we do the audit, we create a plan. How often are you meeting with your employees? Are you having daily meetings, weekly meetings, quarterly meetings? What messages are you delivering? And then you kind of measure, are people still confused? Go out and ask them questions. How well are they understanding your new protocols, your new plans, your new procedures? You can't just put these procedures in place and not get feedback from the employees, weekly, monthly, quarterly. So it's a constant dialogue going on in the workplace.
I'm pretty good at email, and I feel like I see most of them that come my way, but I don't often. And I think I pay a lot of attention to it. But the other day I had a situation where somebody said, "Hey, you didn't respond to my email." I'm like, "I never saw your email." But thankfully, the person came to me and discussed the issue at hand. How effective is email nowadays? I mean, is a lot of communication lost when you're just sending an email and not maybe incorporating other methods of communication?
Absolutely. And I'll tell you one thing that just came up in another audit at this company. They have a habit of sending emails out, CCing everybody under the sun. And then there's no call to action. So they're using the email as a way of just getting something off their plate. Like, okay, I sent the email out, you guys figure it out, but nobody knows who's supposed to do what. And so nobody reacts, nobody does anything. So emails are good to maybe reiterate a meeting, put things in writing so things are not lost. But when it becomes the main form of the way you communicate, a lot is lost because we lose facial expression, we lose tone of voice. Things are misunderstood in email. Emails are really good when you're just reiterating a meeting or putting things in writing. But when it becomes your main form of communication, a lot is lost.
Yeah. And don't wear a mask either, because you also miss those, cues, those facial
Yeah,
cues, a smile or a
yeah,
smirk or what,
yeah.
those
That's
things too. I think
true.
we learned our lesson a few years ago about that.
Yeah,
Hey, the book is
absolutely.
called Conversations That Create the Culture. It's written by Vanessa Denhut Garmo. Vanessa, where do people get the book?
It's on Amazon Kindle. It's an ebook. It's only about 40 pages, and it's really sharing 14 insights to leaders of why you can benefit from a communications audit. You can learn a lot from auditing your company and how they communicate.
All right. And I know that you head up Epiphany Communications as well. So people can, if they want to do an audit, they can go right to you.
Sure. Yes. They
Yeah.
can go directly to me. Yeah.
Wonderful. So I appreciate you having on the program Vanessa
Thanks,
Denhut Garmo,
Tom.
the author of Conversations That Create the Culture. Vanessa, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for having me.
All right. Always good to talk with Vanessa. All right. We have some comments before we close out the show here. Let's bring them up one by one. Cameron begins with the engineer. $42.2 billion spent over 4 years to connect people to the internet. Zero people connected. $86 billion taken out of the CARES Act to fund private pension plans. Joe's political supporters, unacceptable. You're so right. There's so much fraud, I think, and so much waste that is going on here. Think about that. Not one internet connection made. You got 42 billion, not to mention the fact, and I brought up with it in my conversation with Steve Cohen, this COP conference that's taking place in Azerbaijan. I think I said that right, regarding climate change. And what they want to do is continue to take out, tens of trillions of dollars from Western societies. And we are funding this via taxpayers in order to send our wealth elsewhere in order to somehow protect the planet. Do you think that if we spend $20 trillion that the planet will be saved all of a sudden? That's all we need is just money. And they're pretty much admitting that's all they want. They just want to take our money and spend it elsewhere, give it to people. And that's not going to do anything, not one thing for the planet, because I think the planet's just going to be just fine the way it is. Thank you very much. The engineer, always appreciate it. Let's bring up another comment here. It is from Arlene. Hey, Arlene. Good topic and excellent points. Appreciated, Mr. Cohen, by the way. NPR and PBS also should be evaluated whether worthy recipients of taxpayer money. No question about that, Arlene. You're right on the money. NPR and PBS are funded by your tax dollars. And I can tell you, if you go into like a PBS newsroom, in any given city, you will find some of the top-notch equipment and gear and cameras and large studios, and they have all this space that is hardly ever used because it's a waste. Government money, there's just not enough. I mean, there's just plenty. It never runs dry, does it? So they fund these newsroom. They're overcharged. These employees get paid a lot of times a lot more money than the local NBC affiliate down the street because it's taxpayer dollars, so who cares how much we spend? That's the attitude in this government. So I'm grateful for Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk, and I do hope that these members of Congress and these various committees really consider their advice on being lean and mean and efficient and effective in these various programs. And the ones that are not, get rid of them altogether. They're completely unnecessary. So that means, the appropriation bills have to take this very seriously, whatever they recommend from DOGE. Arlene, always good to hear from you. Thank you so much. We got one more, I believe, from Taz. Hey, Taz, how are you? Look at what our bloated government agencies give us. We have one of the unhealthiest populations in the world, overweight and fraught with comorbidities. Thank you, FDA. Spot on. What good are they really doing? You mentioned the FDA and our health crisis. It gets worse and worse. When I was a little kid, we were given, I think at that time it was the 4 food groups, and then they switched over to the food pyramid, and they were both wrong. They were incorrect in terms of what makes you healthy. And since that time, we've gotten fatter, more unhealthy, more cases of kidney disease and kidney failure and sugar and salt and additives and chemicals. It's only gotten worse thanks to the FDA. And so there's a lot of things. And by the way, a lot of pushback about the Department of Education that, Linda McMahon is Donald Trump's pick for the Education Department to be the secretary of it with the ultimate goal of maybe getting rid of it. And people say, oh my goodness, he wants to get rid of education because so many people nowadays who are in this dialogue aren't aware that the Education Department never existed prior, I think, to Jimmy Carter. What was it, 1979, I think it was created? I might be a little bit wrong on the date there, but it was around that time frame. So are you saying that people in the 1950s were not educated? Because I could look back at some historical lessons in 1940s and 1930s. Yes, schools actually did quite better back then before this bureaucratic institution began to dismantle the education system in this country. Education, state by state, has gotten worse under the Department of Education than it was prior to it. So I'm really not against getting rid of it, so long as the local states and districts and counties take education more seriously than these centralized powers that be have over the past several decades. And I'm pretty confident they will, because they care about their children in their local arenas probably far more than some government bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. Thanks for your comment. Very much appreciated. Good point about the ineffectiveness of these bureaucratic agencies. Cameron, do we have one more? That's all. Okay. And that's all we have time for because we are over time. I appreciate you watching today. We, of course, will be back tomorrow at 9 a.m. streaming live on X, Facebook, and YouTube, and living perpetually on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. I'm Tom Jordan. God bless you. Have a great day.